Hello and welcome to the review and recap series for the Making of America, 1789 to 1900. We're now on the third theme within Making of America, which is Civil War and Reconstruction, 1861 to 1877. We're going to split this into two, so the first section that we're going to look at in this video is the Civil War. So we're going to look at causes, African-American experience, and you're going to give yourself a bit of a test on what you have learnt. Okay, so first of all, we're going to start with causes of the American Civil War. I'll use the abbreviation ACW as we go through, so just a reminder that we are talking about the American Civil War when you see that abbreviation. So one of the main causes of the American Civil War are the economic differences over slavery. Remember, we talk about economics, we're talking about money. So the North were against slavery as factory owners in the North had to pay their workers, meaning they lost money. In the South, however, they had slavery on plantations, which was free labour, making them more profit. So because the South didn't have to pay workers because they had slavery, this meant that they were becoming wealthier, whereas in the North, just like in a normal economy, they had to pay their workers, and it meant that factory owners became quite bitter that the South were having all this free labour and they weren't. And this caused tension between the North and the South. So this was a background cause, really, of the American Civil War. It causes tension rather than direct conflict. We also had a group called the abolitionists. Abolitionists, remember, are people who want to end slavery. They predominantly live in the North. There were some that were in the South trying to help slaves escape, but many lived in the North and they were against slavery. Some of these abolitionists were actually escaped slaves or freed slaves themselves. So two names that you could learn for the exam are Frederick Douglass, who was an escaped slave and gave lectures and wrote articles on the immorality of slavery. So good word to use in the exam, immorality, just means why it was wrong. And Harriet Tubman, who assisted hundreds of slaves to freedom on the Underground Railroad. You looked at this system in Year 8, so you may remember this, but this system was where Harriet Tubman helped slaves escape their plantation and took them to different safe houses on the way to a northern state where they would then become free. This again causes conflict between the North and the South. The South feel that abolitionists are challenging their way of life, and helping slaves escape is obviously taking away their workers. So this was a problem of tension. We also have the growing political power of the North. So northern states' populations continue to rise. So remember, the more people you have in an area or a territory, the likelier it is to become a state. And once you have a large population have become a state, the more people that live there, the more political power you have. And this is because you had more representation in Congress. Remember, Congress is the American version of our Parliament, and they pass the laws. So representation in Congress is dependent on the population of states, and the North have larger states, more people in them, and as a result of that, they have more political power. In 1846, Congress had also stated that slavery was to be banned in any new territories gained from Mexico. So again, this causes tension between the North and the South. The South feel that this is unfair and that the North are having too much political power. We then have an agreement which was called the 1850 Compromise. This is made by a Southerner called Henry Clay. He was a congressman. And it stated that California entered the Union as a free state. So remember, California enters the Union in 1850 as a result of the Californian gold rush, because we had over 50,000 people travelling to California alone in 1849. So they are allowed to enter as a free state, and the sale of slaves is going to be banned in Washington. So Washington, remember, the nation's capital, and the sale of slaves is going to be banned there. However, to please the South, Henry Clay states that territories gained from Mexico, for example, New Mexico, could decide themselves whether to allow slavery. Okay, so remember, in 1846, Congress had made this deal that slavery was to be banned in any of these new territories. In 1850, Henry Clay comes up with a compromise that says actually they should be allowed to decide whether or not they want slavery. He also suggests something called the Fugitive Slave Act. This was where if a slave escaped, so for example using the Underground Railroad by Harriet Tubman, it was the legal duty of whoever found them to return the runaway slaves. So California was entered as a free state, but it was always going to be free because it was northern. So it was very unlikely to have slaves because plantations wouldn't have suited the land that was there. And the sale of slaves was banned in Washington, but Washington wasn't using slavery either. So the two things that are northern within this compromise were likely to happen anyway and to have a minimal impact. However, the compromises that were made for the South were very, very positive. So this is clearly pro-Southern, hence who made the compromise, Henry Clay, being a Southerner, and it causes a lot of tension with the North. It goes against what Congress had agreed in 1846, and the 1850 compromise is definitely another background cause of the American Civil War because the North are angry with this compromise. We then have, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This goes against the Missouri Compromise. Now remember, in 1820 to 21, the Missouri Compromise was passed. This stated that any states above Missouri, above the line of Missouri, the border, were to be free. Any states below were to be slave. So the Missouri Compromise was set in stone, really. People had accepted it for many years. In 1854, there is this new act, Kansas-Nebraska, that goes against that. This states that Kansas and Nebraska, which were both above the line, were to decide whether or not they wanted slavery. So this goes against a compromise that has been set in stone, and it causes huge conflict between abolitionists and Southerners. There is actually violence in the Senate and on the streets, so we can clearly see that people are angry about this act as it goes against the Missouri Compromise, which had kept the peace up until this point. Finally, we have two political parties. Now, I've put these in different colours for you. You need to remember which party tends to have the biggest following in which part of the country. So we have the Democrats and the Republicans. The Democrats are Southern, so they believe in plantations, encouraging the growth of plantations, and inevitably, therefore, encouraging the growth of slavery. They dislike factories, and they believe in a strong state government. So each state, remember, has their own political system, but they believe that these state governments should almost have as much, if not more, power than the president has over the whole country. So they believe that each state should be able to decide things themselves. The Republicans, however, are in the North predominantly, and they are pretty much the opposite. They are pro-factories, strong central government rather than state governments, and they believe that slaveholders were too powerful, so they want to limit the power of the slave owners. So these are all of the background causes of the American Civil War. They're all very important. They can all be referenced in the exam, but they didn't spark the American Civil War. They weren't the catalyst, but these were all going on in the background. So we're now going to have a look at really what was the catalyst for why war broke out. So we have two key people that you also need to know for the exam. So a man called Buchanan, who was the Democratic president, he was elected in 1856. He was a Southerner who supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which, remember, was going to allow Kansas and Nebraska to decide whether they wanted slavery despite being above the Missouri Compromise line. And he supported something called the Dred Scott decision, which stated that Congress had no right to ban slavery in the territories because the Constitution stated all Americans had the right to own property. So this is where the wording of the Constitution is difficult, because the word property can be interpreted in different ways. Because the Southerners don't really see the slaves as people, they see them as property, and therefore they believe in the Dred Scott decision, which states that slavery cannot be banned in territories. So Buchanan is a Southern president. He clearly stands up for the rights of the Southerners rather than Northerners. And what this results in is another political party being formed. So this is the first time that we see a party called the Republican Party. And we see Abraham Lincoln being the first candidate to run for the Republican Party. So as a result of Buchanan's clearly Southern stance, there were a lot of people in the North who decided they were not going to vote for the Democrats, and they turned to this new party of the Republicans and to Lincoln. Lincoln portrayed himself as Honest Abe. So a man of the people who was hardworking, against the wealthy plantation owners, against corruption, and he looked very attractive as a candidate to many people in the North in particular. He promises to stop the expansion of slavery. So key here is to see that he is not banning slavery, he's stopping its expansion. So whichever states have slavery now, they can keep it, but it's not going to expand any further. So he would be against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, for example. He also promises a transcontinental railroad, which would run through the northern states, not the southern states. This is going to bring the North an economic benefit that the South won't gain. So the South aren't happy that this railroad is going to be through northern states rather than southern states. And the catalyst really for the American Civil War is that Lincoln wins a solid victory in the presidential election in 1860. So Lincoln is going to be America's next president. And this is the catalyst. So if you're going to use the word catalyst or that spark or that trigger in the exam, you need to know that it is Lincoln's election as the Republican president of the United States in 1860. Okay, so as a result of Lincoln's election, many Southerners believed that the North was going to ban slavery completely and end their way of life. Remember, Lincoln has not promised that. He's only said that he's going to stop the expansion of slavery, but nonetheless, Southerners are nervous of this promise and where it will lead. And therefore, a lot of Southerners begin to push an idea called secession. Secession is in bold on the slide in front of you. It is an important term that you need to know for the exam. And all this means is that Southern states were going to leave the Union. Now, by Union, I mean the United States. So Southern states are going to leave the United States and almost create a separate nation. So in November 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede, and then another 6 states followed. February 1861, the states who had seceded became called the Confederacy. So you need to know, again, that's why it's in bold, that the states that remove themselves from the Union, so they are no longer in the United States, they call themselves the Confederacy. And Jefferson Davis becomes their leader. So Jefferson Davis is essentially going to be fighting Abraham Lincoln in the American Civil War. The South are fighting to remain independent. The North are fighting to keep the Union together. So to keep these Confederate states in the Union, to not allow them to have their independence. Lincoln took his position as president on the 4th of March 1861. And on the 12th of April 1861, the Confederacy opened fire on Union troops at Fort Sumner, and the American Civil War had begun. So April 1861, the Confederacy, remember these states that had seceded, they opened fire on the Union troops, the Northern troops. Okay, so this is when the American Civil War begins. Okay, so dates that you need to know. 1861 to 1865 are the dates of the American Civil War. You do need to know these for the exam. We have the Union, which are predominantly the northern states, and President Lincoln is their representative, versus the Confederacy, who are the southern states who had seceded. And remember, Jefferson Davis, who you can see on the right of the screen, he is the person that is going to be fighting or directing, the fighting in the South. Okay, you can see at the bottom of your screen an image has just appeared. The flag that you can see on the right is the Confederate flag. Any of you that have been interested in modern day American politics will have seen this flag, and it is predominantly Southerners now who still identify with this flag of the Confederacy, these states that had left the Union. On the left, you can see the standard United States of America flag that we should all recognise today. Okay, let's have a look then at the African-American experience of the American Civil War. So remember here we're talking about Black Americans. Remember the vast majority of them were enslaved, those that were in the South anyway, and we're going to have a look at what their experience was. So 1861 to 1862, which remember is the start of the American Civil War. Life for African Americans, I will refer to them as AAs on this slide. So when I speak about AAs, I'm talking about African Americans. So life for African Americans was much the same as before the war. So in the North, we had low-paid jobs, poor quality housing, segregated schools. Segregation, remember, means separate. So schools for white children, schools for black children. Public places were also segregated. So again, shops that only white people could go in, buses, for example, that only white people could use or black people could use, so public places were also segregated. That was in the north. In the south, remember, this is where we have slavery and the plantations. So there's no such thing as low-paid jobs in the south. It is slavery, no wages at all. You are the property of your plantation owner. So they were slaves. They were cramped in plantation housing. It was illegal for African Americans to be educated. Slaves were property and couldn't use any public facilities without permission. So clearly we can see that African Americans, their life is much, much worse in the South. But if you were in the North, even if you were free, life wasn't particularly great for you either. Okay, we have a key term called contraband. Again, this is in bold on the screen that you can see. So when the American Civil War began, many black volunteers came forward to join the Union Army. They were not allowed. Lincoln would have liked to allow these men to fight because it would have given him more soldiers. This is nothing to do with him having ideas about equality. It would have simply been more men on the ground. However, he refuses to do this because he doesn't want to anger the South anymore. Remember, he is fighting to keep the Union together, so he's hoping that the Confederacy will come back, and perhaps this fight could be cut short. So he doesn't want to anger the South anymore. He doesn't want to allow black volunteers to join the Union Army. However, many slaves ran away from the South, and those that escaped, who had managed to escape to a northern state within the Union, they wanted to fight for the army. Lincoln states that they could be kept as contraband of war. So remember, contraband we think of today as kind of an illegal substance, something that has been taken because it is not allowed, it's legal. Lincoln takes these men as contraband of war, and he says they can work for the Union Army. So they can't fight, but they can work, rather than being sent back to their masters. So this is a bit of a compromise. They are allowed to keep their freedom, they are allowed to work for the Union Army. They are not sent back to their masters, but they aren't allowed to fight. Okay, we then have, in July 1862, something called the Second Confiscation Act. This would be very specific for the exam, very, very impressive if you could reference this. So any slave holding land taken by any slave holding land taken by the Union Army automatically became free. So I want you to think of a place in particular called the Sea Islands, and the slaves who lived there automatically became free when the Union Army took them, and they were allowed to keep the land for themselves, and they set up a new town called Mitchellville. So this is an example of Lincoln again trying to take things from the South without making them very, very angry, because he isn't using them as fighters, but he is giving them the right to have land, and he's taking that land from the Southerners, and this is obviously going to cause anger, but he's, remember, still not allowing them to fight. But the Second Confiscation Act is something that is important for the exam. If you could reference it, it would look very impressive, and the Sea Islands would be the best example of the Union Army taking land and giving it to the slaves. Okay, the 1st of January 1863, we have a very, very significant announcement, and this is the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, you absolutely need to know this in the exam. You need to know the wording of it. You need to use that phrase, Emancipation Proclamation. And this is where Lincoln promises that if the Union win the Civil War, then any African Americans will not be slaves. They will be free. Slavery will end as an institution within the United States of America. The Emancipation Proclamation does not free all of the slaves in America. It is a promise that if the Union win, that is what will happen. Okay, as the war progresses, we start to see Lincoln changing his mind. After the Emancipation Proclamation, he has already made the promise that slaves will be freed. So therefore, it makes sense that after that, there isn't really any point in stopping black Americans fighting for the Union Army. So this is where we see the development of black regiments. So in 1863, we have the 1st African American Regiment, and we have 70% of northern black men joining the Union Army. So they are clearly desperate to fight for the Union, to fight for Lincoln, and Lincoln is now going to use these people to help him to victory. So these men were crucial in helping secure a Union victory. However, African Americans were not allowed to become officers, they were paid less than white soldiers, and they were given labour duties to do, such as digging ditches. So we can clearly see that as much as Lincoln wanted them to be part of the Union Army so they could help him win, they are not treated equally. Equal pay is eventually granted in 1864, but this was something that the African Americans had to fight very hard for. Finally, we have opportunities for freed slaves. So by 1865, remember by the end of the American Civil War, 200,000 African Americans have been taught how to read and write, so they are no longer illiterate. This is going to help them, hopefully, gain jobs when slavery is no more. Ex-slaves who had helped General Sherman against the Confederates in the South were given 40 acres of land and a mule, so a horse. So this is a reward for helping fight against their former owners. And the government also rented out small farms to ex-slaves. So this is the first opportunity, really, that they can have their own land and grow crops. And many got jobs such as firemen, barbers and mechanics. So we have people going into employment as well. So we can clearly see that the African American experience improves as the war goes on. And at the end of the American Civil War, naturally African Americans would expect that their lives are going to be vastly improved because of the Emancipation Proclamation and the promise that they were going to be free, as well as these opportunities for freed slaves. Okay, so that is the first section, which is on the Civil War. So I would now ask you to pause the video, have a go at the 6 questions that are on the slide, and you can play the video again when you want to hear the answers to these, and I will run through them with you. Okay, so number 1, what was an abolitionist? Give 2 famous examples. So an abolitionist, remember, is somebody who wanted slavery banned, and the 2 examples that we spoke of were Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, who, remember, had the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass was the escaped slave who used to give kind of lectures and write essays about slavery. Which act went against the Missouri Compromise and how? We have the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which stated that Kansas and Nebraska could decide whether they wanted slavery or not. So they were above the Missouri Compromise line, but they could decide whether they wanted slavery. And remember, this went against the Missouri Compromise. Number 3, what were the names of the 2 main political parties and which one represented the North and which one represented the South? We have the Democrats, who were Southern. Remember, we had Buchanan, who was elected in 1856. And we have the Republicans, who were Northern. Remember, we have Lincoln, who was elected in 1860, which, remember, is that catalyst of the American Civil War. Number 4, what was the Dred Scott decision and which president supported it? The Dred Scott decision, remember, stated that Congress had no right to ban slavery in the territories because the Constitution stated that all Americans had the right to own property. And remember, the South saw slaves as property. And it is President Buchanan who supports this view. This is one of the decisions that led many previous Democrats to turn to the Republican Party and to vote for Lincoln in the 1860 election. Number 5, give 2 promises Lincoln made in his presidential campaign which would anger the South. He promises that he's going to stop the expansion of slavery. So remember, he's not going to ban it, but he's going to stop it expanding any further. And he also states that he's going to create a transcontinental railroad through the northern states of America rather than the South. This is going to make the North a lot of money. And finally, what was the Emancipation Proclamation and when was it stated? Remember, it was stated in 1863, so bang in the middle of the American Civil War, and it stated that millions of slaves were promised that a Union victory in the American Civil War would gain them freedom. So it doesn't ban slavery at the time, but if the Union win, slavery will be banned. And remember, this leads then to Lincoln conceding and allowing African Americans to fight for the Union Army in the American Civil War from 1863. Okay, the next thing that we are going to look at is Reconstruction, which is the second part of the third topic in Making of America. So that will be our next video.